She wasn't making a sound. That was the first thing. If she had been wailing, if she had been the kind of crying that pulls every adult in a 50-foot radius toward it, someone would have found her sooner. Someone would have come running. There would have been a whole response, a whole gathering of concerned faces and soft voices, and someone dispatching a bridesmaid to find the mother. But Renley wasn't making a sound. She was sitting on a stone bench at the edge of a garden in Mill Haven, Connecticut, on a Saturday evening in late September, with a flower girl basket on her lap and petals arranged beside her on the stone in a pattern that only she understood. And her face was wet, and she was not wiping it. Margot Ellison was 38 years old, and she had not planned to be outside. She had planned to be inside, at the table with Diane, eating the salmon that had arrived lukewarm and drinking the wine that was better than she had expected. She had planned to do the thing you do at a wedding when you are someone's plus one and you don't know many people. The thing where you stay close to the person who brought you and laugh at the right moments and find the whole experience pleasant in a muted, slightly outside of it way. But Diane had found someone to talk to near the bar, and the tent had gotten warm, and Margot had stepped outside for air. She was not looking for anything. She was not the kind of person who goes looking for things at other people's weddings. She was the kind of person who steps outside, takes a breath, looks at the sky for a moment, and goes back in. She almost did exactly that. What stopped her was not the crying. It was the arrangement. Renley was placing each petal with a precision that Margot recognized, not from children, but from adults doing something with their hands when they have no other way to hold what they are feeling. The way someone straightens objects on a desk. The way someone folds and refolds a piece of paper. The hands doing something because the rest of the self has nowhere to put the weight. Margot stood at the edge of the garden for a moment. Then she walked over and sat down on the bench. Not next to Renley. A few feet away. She didn't say anything. If you have been at a wedding, really been at one, not just physically present, but emotionally somewhere inside the specific atmosphere of a wedding, you know what it sounds like from outside. You know the way the music reaches you muffled through canvas. The way laughter arrives in waves and then retreats. The way the whole thing pulses with a warmth that, from a certain distance, in a certain light, can feel like something you are almost touching but not quite. Margot sat on that bench and listened to the sound of a wedding happening 30 feet away, and Renley sat beside her and arranged her petals. The first thing Renley said was not about her father. It was about the tooth. She turned to Margot, not a full turn, a partial one, the kind a child makes when they have decided to risk a small thing, and opened her mouth slightly and pointed at the lower left side. "It's been loose for a long time," she said. Margot leaned in and looked. The tooth was hanging at an angle that suggested it had been ready to come out for weeks. The kind of loose that would have driven most children to constant wiggling. The kind that a parent usually helps with, a piece of floss, a doorknob, or just 2 fingers and a quick twist if the child is brave enough. "It really is," Margot said. "My dad does it," Renley said. "He has a way." She closed her mouth and looked back at the petals. This is the part one keep coming back to. Not the tooth, exactly, but the casualness of it. The way she said my dad has a way as if it were a simple fact about the world. The way certain children state things that are both completely ordinary and, in context, completely devastating. My dad has a way. Present tense. He has a way. Not he had a way. Not he used to. He has one. It exists. It is just not available right now. On this particular evening. In this particular garden. At this particular wedding where Renley's mother is on the dance floor inside, and Renley is outside on a stone bench arranging petals in a pattern that only she understands. I need to stop here for a moment, because I want to be careful about what I am about to tell you. There is a version of this story that is easy to tell. The version where there is a clear villain, where someone made a monstrous choice and a child suffered for it, and a stranger uncovered the truth and justice arrived cleanly at the end. That version is not this story. This story is harder than that. Because the hardest stories are not the ones where someone did something terrible. The hardest stories are the ones where everyone involved was, in some definition of the word, in some version of the accounting, doing their best. And it still came to a 6-year-old sitting alone on a stone bench while the music played inside. Margot didn't ask many questions. This is something I've thought about a lot. The particular skill of not asking questions. Of sitting beside someone and letting the silence do the work. Most of us are too frightened of silence to let it do anything. We fill it immediately. We rush in with words because the absence of words feels like a failure. Margot didn't do that. She sat, and Renley, in the way of children who have been given enough space, began to fill it herself. It came in pieces. Not a narrative. Not an explanation. Children don't explain, they surface. They bring things up the way water brings things up, in the order the current chooses, not the order a storyteller would choose. The tooth. The father. The fact that he had dropped her off that morning. He drove away before I got inside, Renley said. This was stated without particular emphasis. The way you state a fact about weather. How long were you waiting? Margot asked. Renley thought about it. Until the flowers came, she said. Margot would learn later that the flowers had arrived at the venue at 10:45 in the morning. The ceremony had started at 1. Before I go further, I want to explain something. There's a term in psychology, ambiguous loss. It was developed by a family therapist named Pauline Boss, and it describes a specific kind of grief. The grief of losing someone who is still present, or the grief of someone being absent who is still technically there. It is the grief of a relationship that is neither ended nor intact, neither here nor gone. Modern analogy: imagine a phone call that connects, but no one speaks. The line is open. Something is being transmitted, but nothing is arriving. The reason this matters here is that Renley was not grieving a death. She was not grieving an abandonment in any clean sense. Her father had driven her to the venue. He had done what he was supposed to do. Her mother was inside, 30 feet away, on the dance floor. Nobody was gone, and Renley was grieving anyway. That is ambiguous loss. That is the thing that doesn't have a ceremony. The thing nobody gives you language for when you are 6 years old. Margot sat with Renley for 23 minutes. She knows the number because she checked her phone at some point. Not to look at messages, but because there was a moment when she thought she should probably find someone, alert someone, do the practical thing. And when she looked at the screen and then back at Renley, she didn't move. She stayed. What she discovered did not arrive as a revelation. This is the part that is important to understand. When people tell this kind of story, they reach for the word discovered because it implies a moment, a single thing uncovered, a before and an after. The truth dropped into view like something falling from a shelf. It wasn't like that. What Margot discovered was an accumulation. The 2 hours Renley had spent alone at the venue before anyone came to collect her. The way Renley talked about her father. Not with resentment, not with anger, but with the careful neutrality of a child who has been, in some unspoken way, asked to be neutral. The way she talked about Philip, her mother's new husband, the man who was currently dancing inside, which was to say, she barely talked about him at all. Not with hostility. With the particular blankness of someone who has not yet decided what a person means to them and is waiting to find out. And the way she talked about her mother. She did not say anything cruel about Cressida. She didn't say anything negative at all. What she said was small and factual, and, in its smallness, somehow more revealing than anything dramatic could have been. She said, "Mommy has been really busy." She said it the way a child says something they have heard adults say, as a piece of received language. Something handed to her and repeated. "Mommy has been really busy." Margot quietly approached one of the bridesmaids, a woman named Odette, and asked where Renley's mother was. There was a pause before the answer came. That pause. I keep coming back to that pause. It was not a long one. It was the kind of pause that has a shape to it. The kind that means someone is selecting, choosing which version of the truth is appropriate for this conversation. In this doorway, at this moment of someone else's wedding. "She's on the dance floor," Odette said. "Does she know Renley's outside?" Margot asked. Another pause. Shorter this time, but the same shape. "I'll let her know," Odette said. Cressida did not come to the garden. A wedding coordinator came. Then Odette. Renley was collected gently, warmly, by people who were kind to her and competent and well-meaning. She picked up her flower girl basket and held it with both hands, the way she had when she arrived that morning. She didn't look back. If you're half listening to this while doing something else, I need you to actually look up for a moment. Because what I'm about to tell you is not the dramatic part of this story. It is the quiet part. And the quiet parts are where the truth usually lives. Margot stood in the garden for a while after Renley was brought inside. The music was louder now. Someone had made a toast she couldn't quite hear. Something with laughter in it. Something that ended in applause. She had Odette's number in her phone. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a theory. She had the particular feeling that something had been left unfinished in a way she couldn't name, and the phone number of a woman who, she would later discover, had been thinking the same thing for 3 months. This is where the story becomes something else. Because Margot Ellison was not an investigator. She was not a social worker or a therapist or a mandated reporter or anyone with a professional framework for what she had just experienced. She was a 38-year-old woman who had gone outside a wedding tent for air and found a little girl arranging petals on a stone bench. She was, to use the precise word, a stranger. And strangers have a particular kind of vision. They are not inside the story. They have not been watching it slowly unfold over months, becoming accustomed to each new increment. They encounter it whole, without the gradual adjustment that allows the people inside it to stop seeing what has been happening. The technical term for what Margot had was outsider perspective. The psychological function of it is this. When you have been watching something change slowly, each new change feels small because you are comparing it only to the previous moment. A stranger compares it to baseline, to what something should look like, to what a child sitting alone at a wedding, crying silently, with a loose tooth that her absent father usually helps with, should look like. It should not look like this. She texted Odette 4 days later. She kept it simple. She said she had been thinking about Renley. She asked if Renley was okay. Odette called her back within the hour. What Odette told her did not arrive neatly either. It arrived the way things arrive when someone has been holding them for a long time and has finally found a person who seems, inexplicably, like the right person to tell. Odette had been Cressida's friend for 11 years. She had been a bridesmaid at the first wedding, the wedding to Garrett. She had watched that marriage in a way that only old friends watch marriages, with love and attention and a private archive of moments that never made it into any conversation. She had liked Garrett. This is important, not as a character judgment, as an architectural fact of the story, because Odette was not someone who disliked Philip and therefore saw the situation through that lens. She had approached Philip, she said, wanting to like him. She had tried for 8 months to find the version of Philip that made sense as Cressida's choice. What she had found, she said, was not a bad man. He was not cruel. He did not rage. There was nothing she could point to cleanly and say, "Here, this is the thing, this is the problem." What she had found was, and she paused here for a long time before she used this word, displacement. Let me explain what she meant. Philip had come into a family that already existed. A mother, a daughter, a history, a set of loyalties, a specific language of 2 people who had been figuring each other out for 6 years. That family had a shape. And Philip, not out of malice, not out of anything she could call intentional, had been, very slowly, reshaping it. It was small things. The way plans involving Garrett were discussed as inconveniences. The way Renly's references to her father were met with a particular quality of silence. Not hostile, not punishing, but somehow less warm than everything else. The way Cressida had stopped relaying Garrett's requests to see Renly with the neutrality she had once managed, and had begun relaying them with a framing that was not quite neutral. Nothing big, nothing dramatic. A degree here, a degree there. Over 8 months, that is a significant distance from where you started. I want to be careful again. I am not here to tell you that Cressida was a villain. She was not. She was a woman who had loved and lost, and found something new and was trying to protect it in the ways that felt available to her. She was a woman who was, in some genuine sense, happy on her wedding day. And she was also a woman who had left her 6-year-old daughter at a venue for 2 hours without checking whether anyone was with her. Both of these things are true simultaneously. That is not a contradiction. That is a portrait. Here's where it gets complicated. And I mean that in the most specific sense. Margot was, by this point, for days out from the wedding and in possession of information that had changed the shape of what she had witnessed. She was not inside the story. She had no claim on it. She had sat with a child for 23 minutes on a stone bench, and then the child had been collected, and Margot had gone back inside and found Diane and driven home and spent 4 days not being able to stop thinking about it. She was a stranger who had found something. What do you do with something you find that doesn't belong to you? What Margot did was this. She kept talking to Odette, not with a plan, not with a strategy, with the particular uncertainty of 2 people who are trying to understand something together, not because they have the right to understand it, but because it has lodged itself in them and they cannot dislodge it by themselves. Odette knew Garrett's number. She had kept it in her phone after the divorce, the way you keep numbers you think you might someday need, not because you have a reason, but because deleting them feels like a decision you are not ready to make. She had not called him. She called him now. Garrett Voss was 34 years old, and he answered on the second ring. He was, Odette said, very quiet at the beginning of the call. The particular quiet of someone who has been waiting for a call they didn't know they were waiting for. He asked about Renley before she got through her second sentence. What Garrett said did not change the shape of what had happened. It added depth to it. He said he had asked, twice in the month before the wedding, whether Renley could spend that weekend with him. He said the reasons given for the answer were logistical, a fitting, a rehearsal dinner, a schedule that didn't accommodate a switch. He said he had accepted those reasons. He was trying, he said, to be the kind of co-parent that didn't make things harder than they already were. He had dropped Renley at the venue at 10:45 in the morning. He had driven away. He had done this because he had been told there would be people there to receive her. He had not known she would wait alone for 2 hours. When Odette told him, there was a silence on the phone that lasted long enough that she checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. She didn't say anything when I picked her up Sunday, Garrett said finally. She just showed me her tooth. I want to pause on that. I want to give that sentence the space it deserves. She just showed me her tooth. She had been waiting for him since Saturday. She had been sitting on that stone bench with a loose tooth that her dad usually helps with. She had shown it to a stranger. She had been collected by a wedding coordinator and a bridesmaid and returned to a reception that was not hers. And when she finally saw her father the next morning, she showed him the tooth. Because that was the thing she had been saving. Actual stop. I have to be honest with you about something. When I was putting this together, when I was sitting with the sequence of it, trying to understand what this story was about at its core, I kept landing in the wrong place. I kept trying to make it about a decision someone made. About a moment someone could have chosen differently. About the thing that, if you changed it, would have changed everything. But every time I found that moment, I found another one behind it. And behind that, another one. Going back further than the wedding. Further than the engagement. Further than the divorce. What I eventually understood is that this story is not about a moment. It is about a drift. Drift is not a decision. Drift is what happens when no single decision is bad enough to correct for. It is the accumulated effect of choices that were each, individually, defensible. Choices that, in the moment they were made, felt like the reasonable response to the specific pressure of that specific moment. The reasonable response to the awkwardness of co-parenting. The reasonable response to a new relationship that needed space to establish itself. The reasonable response to a 6-year-old who was, on most days, apparently fine. Fine. That word. Children are so good at fine. They are so good at taking what they are given and working with it. At accepting the shape of the world they have been handed and finding a way to live inside it. At performing the competence that adults need to see in order to feel that everything is okay. Renley had been fine for months. She was fine at the rehearsal dinner. She was fine at the dress fitting. She was fine at school, by all accounts. She was fine, until she was sitting on a stone bench in a garden with petals on the stone beside her, and her face was wet, and she was not wiping it. I know where you're watching this. Maybe it's late. Maybe you're supposed to be doing something else right now. Maybe this landed in your feed at a strange hour when you weren't expecting to feel anything, and now you're feeling something and you're not entirely sure what to do with it. If you've made it this far, I think you already know why this story matters to you specifically. Margot met Renley once more. This was 6 weeks after the wedding, and it was not planned. It was the particular accident of a small town where people who have been briefly connected by unusual circumstances occasionally cross paths in ordinary ones. They were at a farmer's market. Garrett had Renley that weekend. Margot was there with Diane, who had, by that point, made something more official with the man from the wedding bar and was in the kind of early relationship glow that makes grocery shopping feel like an event. Margot saw Renley first. Renley was standing at a table of apple varieties, picking each one up and examining it with the concentration of someone conducting a very serious evaluation. Garrett was a few feet away, paying for something. Margot almost didn't approach. She was a stranger. She had been a stranger at a wedding. She had no role in this child's life and no expectation of one. And then Renley looked up. Recognition is a strange thing in children. It is less guarded than in adults. When Renley looked up and saw Margot, there was no moment of calculation, no trying to place her, no running of social probabilities. There was just the direct, unmediated acknowledgement of someone she had met before. The lady from the garden, Renley said. Not loudly, just to herself, or to the apple she was holding. But Margot heard it. Garrett introduced himself. He already knew who Margot was. Odette had told him. He shook her hand with the particular warmth of someone who is grateful to a person for something that would be awkward to name in a farmer's market. Renley showed Margot the gap in her lower left jaw. The tooth was gone. My dad did it, she said. He has a way. I am going to tell you something now that I have been building toward for this entire story. Not the watch-through reward, not the twist, not the revelation, because this is not that kind of story. There is no twist. There is no revelation that reframes everything that came before it into something other than what it appeared to be. What I am going to tell you is the thing that is true and is not dramatic and is, for that reason, the hardest thing to say. The unthinkable thing that Margot discovered that evening at the wedding was not a secret. It was not a hidden crime. It was not something that anyone had deliberately concealed or that required uncovering in any dramatic sense. It was this. A child can be surrounded by people who love her and still be alone. A family can be reorganized with the best of intentions and still leave someone sitting outside of it on a stone bench, arranging petals in the fading light. An adult, a good adult, a loving adult, an adult who is not a villain and is not cruel and is not anything that would appear on a list of warning signs, can be so absorbed in the process of building their own life that they lose track, for long enough to matter, of the small person watching it happen. This is the part that the way we tell these stories usually protects us from. We want it to be monstrous. We want there to be a thing that someone did that is clearly, unambiguously, obviously wrong, because then we know what to do with it. We condemn the thing. We identify the person who did it. We separate ourselves from them. We go back to our lives reassured that we are not that. But what do you do when the thing is not monstrous? What do you do when the thing is drift? Distraction? The entirely human capacity to prioritize the immediate and the visible over the quiet and the patient? What do you do when the person who left the child waiting is someone you would recognize? Someone whose choices, in the specific pressure of each specific moment, you might have made yourself? Margot did not call Cressida. She thought about it. She held the idea of it for weeks, turning it over the way you turn something over when you're not sure what it is. She had no right to call. She had no claim on the outcome. She was a stranger who had sat on a bench for 23 minutes. What she had was a phone number for Odette. What she had was the image of a little girl who was fine, 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 until she wasn't. What she had. And this is the piece she kept returning to, the piece she has kept returning to in the years since, was the moment Renley looked up and said the lady from the garden. Not because it was sentimental. Not because it meant they had a bond that transcended the 23 minutes they had spent together. But because it meant Renley remembered. Children remember the people who sat with them when everyone else was inside. They remember without knowing they are remembering, without being able to articulate what they are holding. They carry it forward in the same quiet, steady way that they carry everything they are not yet given language for. I want to tell you what happened to Renley. I can tell you what Odette has told me, which is partial, which is filtered through the perspective of someone who loves Cressida and is honest enough to hold her accountable in the same breath. Cressida and Philip are still married. This is not the story that ends with a divorce. Cressida is not a bad mother. She is, and Odette says this carefully, chooses the word carefully, recalibrating. She is in a period of honest examination that the wedding, and what came after, contributed to in ways that are not fully visible from outside. Garrett has Renley on alternating weekends and every other holiday. He has stopped trying to be the kind of co-parent who doesn't make things harder and has started trying to be the kind of co-parent who says clearly what his daughter needs. These are not the same project, it turns out. Renley is 7 now. She lost 2 more teeth. Her father helped with both of them. She is, by all accounts, fine. But I want to say something about that word. Fine is not a destination. Fine is where children wait. It is the holding pattern they enter when the world is asking too much of them, and they do not yet have the tools to ask for what they need. Fine is the arrangement of petals on a stone bench. Fine is the face that is wet and not being wiped. Fine is showing a loose tooth to a stranger because the person who usually helps with it drove away before you got inside. Fine is not the absence of pain. It is the management of it, by a person who is 6 years old and doing the best she can with what she has been given. Do you remember the beginning of this story? She wasn't making a sound. That was the first thing. I told you that because I wanted you to understand what Margot had found before I told you what she had found. I wanted you to sit with the silence of it. The specific quality of a grief that does not announce itself. That does not demand. That does not reach out and make itself impossible to ignore. The grief that arranges itself neatly and waits. The hardest thing about this story, the thing I have been circling since I first encountered it, is not what anyone did. It is what it asks of us. Because Margot Ellison was a stranger at a wedding. She had no obligation. She had stepped outside for air. She had no professional mandate, no personal connection, no framework for what she was about to encounter. She just sat down. She sat down on a bench a few feet from a child and did not say anything for a while and let the silence do the work. And that, the simplest possible act, the act that required nothing except the willingness to stay, was what the child needed. Not rescue, not investigation, not even understanding, just someone willing to sit in the garden when everyone else was inside. I don't know what to do with that. I genuinely don't. I've been sitting with this story for long enough that I've lost track of what I expected to learn from it, and what I've actually learned from it, and whether those are the same thing or something very different. What I know is this. There are children sitting in gardens at events designed for adults, and they are arranging petals and patterns that only they understand, and they are not making a sound. And if you do not step outside for air at the right moment, you will not find them. And most of the time, nobody steps outside. Here's what I want to ask you. Not about Cressida. Not about Garrett. Not about anyone in this story who is not you. I want to ask about the last time you were fine. The last time someone asked you how you were doing, and you said fine, because the truth was something that didn't have a ceremony, something nobody had given you language for, something you were managing in the particular quiet way of people who have learned that their pain, if it is not dramatic enough, will not be collected. I want to ask whether there was ever someone who sat with you, who didn't ask questions at first, who just sat, who let the silence do the work until you were ready to surface something. And if there was, I want to ask whether you have been that person for someone else. Because that is what this story is about, at the bottom of everything. Not the wedding, not the discovery, not the unthinkable thing that turned out to be very quiet and very human and very ordinary in the way that most true things are ordinary. It is about the act of sitting down, on a bench, a few feet away, without a plan, and staying. If this story landed somewhere specific for you, if there is a moment in it that you recognized from your own life, something you handled the same way or differently, something you are still carrying without language for it, I want to hear it. Drop it in the comments. Not a reaction, not a verdict. The actual thing this story brought up for you, if you're willing. I read them. There is a video on this channel about the silence that comes after a relationship ends. Not the dramatic silence, not the silence of a fight or a goodbye, but the silence of the version of yourself that existed inside that relationship. The version that had no idea it was disappearing. If this story is sitting with you, that one is worth watching next. Share this with the specific person in your life who has been fine for too long. They'll know what you mean.